History loves to tell us that empires fall because of great battles, powerful revolutions, or mighty invasions. But the truth? Many of the most powerful civilizations in history were brought to their knees by things so small, so quiet, you'd barely notice them. Not armies, but insects. Not kings, but whispers. Not cannon fire, but paper. These are the tiny, almost invisible forces that toppled the giants of history. And you won't believe how something so small could destroy something so great. Imagine standing on the walls of a great empire, stone towers stretching to the horizon, banners snapping in the wind, soldiers in perfect formation below. You look out and think, nothing could ever take this down, and yet, one day, it does fall. Not to some massive army crashing through the gates in a blaze of glory, but to something small, quiet, and almost invisible at first. A whisper that turns into a storm, a tiny crack in the armor that spreads until the whole structure crumbles. History loves to glorify the big battles, the epic last stands, the moments when the fate of nations seems to be decided in an explosion of chaos. But the truth? Some of the greatest powers in history didn't fall because of the big moments. They fell because of quiet ones, things so subtle, so overlooked, that no one saw them coming until it was too late. These are the termites that eat away at the beams, while the castle still looks solid from the outside. The drip of water that eventually hollows the stone. The little, almost boring problems that, given enough time, will bring even the mightiest empire to its knees. And if you think this is all ancient history, think again. These quiet forces are still out there, reshaping our world today, just as they did thousands of years ago. So tonight we're going to look at 12 moments in history where the silent, the subtle, and the small didn't just play a role, they toppled giants. We'll see how the Persian Empire cracked not just from war, but from whispers. How the mighty Ming dynasty began to rot from within because of something most people ignored. How the Roman Empire, which thought it was eternal, found itself undone by forces it didn't even consider threats until it was far too late. We start with a power so dominant, so confident, that no one in their right mind could have predicted its fall. And yet, all it took was a few missing coins. Was the quiet collapse of the Spanish Empire's wealth. In the late 1500s, Spain was on top of the world, literally. The empire stretched from Europe to the Americas, swallowing entire continents, fueled by an endless stream of gold and silver pouring in from the New World. In Madrid, the royal court sparkled with jewels, fine silks, and the smug certainty that this dominance would last forever. But here's the thing. While Spain was rich in treasure, it was quietly bankrupt in sense. The empire relied so heavily on the flow of silver from its colonies that it neglected the boring but essential stuff, things like investing in its own economy, building sustainable industries, and encouraging domestic trade. For decades, ship after ship unloaded staggering amounts of silver into Spanish ports. But instead of using that wealth to build lasting strength, Spain spent it on wars across Europe, on endless luxury for the nobility, and on importing goods instead of producing them. The economy became dependent on this river of silver, and everyone assumed it would never stop. Except it did. By the early 1600s, silver production in the Americas began to slow. At the same time, other European powers, England, France, the Dutch, started building more efficient trade networks, often intercepting Spanish shipments along the way. Inflation quietly crept in, eating away at the value of the silver Spain still had. Prices soared, debts mounted, and without a strong internal economy to fall back on, Spain's power began to quietly rot from within. There was no single decisive battle that ended the Spanish Golden Age. It wasn't crushed in a single day. Instead, it bled out economically over decades, proof that even the richest empire can be undone if it doesn't notice the slow leak in its own treasure chest. Next, we move east, to an empire so vast that it felt like it had swallowed the horizon. But the thing that began its fall wasn't an invading army or a catastrophic rebellion. It was something so small that leaders brushed it aside as unimportant until it destroyed everything. Sometimes the downfall of an empire begins not with an invading army, but with something as simple as a grain of sand in the gears of its daily life. For ancient powers, these small cracks were easy to ignore until they weren't. One such crack appeared in the Byzantine Empire, the glittering remnant of Rome that ruled from Constantinople for over 1,000 years. You might expect its slow decline to be caused by relentless wars or the rise of new enemies, but one of its most devastating blows came from a disease. Not a plague that wiped out everyone overnight, but a creeping, recurrent illness that quietly drained the empire's strength over decades. It began in the mid-6th century. Ships coming from Egypt carried more than grain. Rats hid in the cargo, and inside their fleas lurked the bacterium that causes bubonic plague. The first wave was catastrophic, but it didn't end there. Outbreak after outbreak returned, generation after generation. Populations shrank. Farmlands went untended. Armies struggled to find recruits. Tax revenues collapsed. By the time foreign enemies pressed harder at the borders, the Byzantines were already hollowed out. The cities still looked rich on the outside, but the beating heart of the empire, its people, had been quietly weakened by something too small to even see with the naked eye. And the Byzantines weren't alone in falling to something silent. Jump forward a millennium to the Spanish Empire, at the height of its global dominance in the 16th and 17th centuries. Spain was flush with silver from the Americas, a superpower feared across Europe. But that silver came with an invisible curse: inflation. It sounds boring compared to epic battles, but inflation was like a slow leak in the empire's fortune. The more silver ships brought home, the less each coin was worth. Prices skyrocketed, wages couldn't keep up, and the government, addicted to spending, kept borrowing more. Merchants in Amsterdam and London adapted quickly, but Spain clung to old systems. Over time, their wealth became an illusion. Armies were harder to pay, infrastructure rotted, and rivals overtook them without firing a shot. An empire built on treasure was quietly destroyed by the very treasure it depended on. The pattern repeats again and again. Big powers rarely see the quiet dangers for what they are. They prepare for armies, sieges, and rebellions, but not for things that feel small, technical, or unthreatening. The next example takes us to the world's largest land empire, the Mongols, and a collapse that started not from war, but from the slow decay of their communication network. The Mongols didn't just conquer, they connected. They built a sprawling relay system, a series of stations and riders that could carry a message from China to Europe in weeks. It was the internet of the 13th century, and it kept their empire running like a machine. But over time, corruption crept in. Local officials pocketed resources meant for maintaining the stations. Riders became unreliable, The speed that had made the Mongols unstoppable began to slow. Messages arrived too late. Orders were outdated before they reached their targets. This wasn't a dramatic collapse. No burning capitals, no decisive battles. It was just a gradual breakdown of a system that everyone had taken for granted. Without it, the vast Mongol territories became harder to control, easier to fracture. And fracture they did. What's striking in all these cases is how quiet the danger was at first. No one in Constantinople thought a few shiprats would help end a 1,000-year empire. No one in Madrid imagined that silver would bleed them dry. No Mongol Khan expected that a bit of laziness at relay stations could help bring down the largest empire the world had ever seen. But that's the danger with these subtle forces. They work slowly, invisibly, until one day the mighty power they've been gnawing at just crumbles. Sometimes the quietest things are not just forces of nature. They are forces of human nature. Not every empire was brought down by storms or plagues. Some were undone by the slow, steady drip of an idea. An idea so small at first you wouldn't even notice it passing between two people in a crowded marketplace. But it spreads. It seeps into minds, into homes, into daily life. And soon, the foundations of power tremble. Take the Soviet Union. For decades it seemed unshakable, an iron curtain wrapped around nearly half the globe. But behind that curtain, whispers started to grow. They weren't battle cries. They weren't uprisings in the streets. They were songs, books, smuggled cassette tapes of banned rock music. The Beatles, Led Zeppelin, Pink Floyd. Music from the West was technically illegal in many parts of the USSR, but people still listened, huddled around record players in dim apartments, knowing they could get in trouble. Why did this matter? Because music is more than sound. It carries an attitude, a lifestyle, a sense of freedom, and when enough people start to feel it, the invisible wall between how life is and how life could be gets thinner. Even Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev would later admit that culture, from literature to rock and roll, loosened the Soviet grip on its own people more than guns ever could. Another quiet force, language, not in the sense of politicians giving speeches, but in the way empires force their language onto conquered peoples, and what happens when those people resist. The British Empire spread English across continents, but it also tried to erase native tongues. In places like Ireland, banning the Irish language was meant to weaken identity. But the quiet persistence of speaking it, at home, in secret, became a rebellion all its own. Centuries later, that cultural survival fueled movements for independence. No army needed, just words passed from parent to child. And then, there's the quietest weapon of all, paper. In 15th century Europe, the printing press seemed like an invention for scholars and churchmen, but soon it became the most dangerous tool in history. The Protestant Reformation wouldn't have spread the way it did without pamphlets rolling off printing presses in thousands of copies, circulating faster than any authority could burn them. When knowledge, or even just doubt, can be printed, folded and slipped under a door, you've got something far more enduring than a sword. The strange thing is, rulers rarely see these quiet forces coming. They prepare for riots, for invasions, for assassinations, but not for a poem, a song, a whispered phrase, or a single page of forbidden writing. And yet, those are the things that can outlast fortresses and topple thrones. Because history's loud moments, the wars, the revolutions, the speeches, often have their roots in something that began in silence. Sometimes a collapse doesn't start with swords or riots. It begins with something as mundane as a broken mailbox. All right, maybe not literally a mailbox, but in the case of the mighty Achaemenid Persian Empire, it was their communication network, the very arteries of their empire, that quietly clogged until the body of their power started dying. You see, the Persians had one of the fastest and most advanced relay systems in the ancient world. Couriers on horseback carried messages along the royal road, stopping at rest stations every few miles to swap tired horses for fresh ones. This meant that messages could fly across thousands of miles in days, not weeks. It was a marvel. But like all great systems, it only worked if it was maintained. Over time, under complacent kings, the road stations fell into disrepair. The postal relays slowed down. Bandits, who once wouldn't dare steal from a royal courier, now began targeting them, knowing the empire's grip on law enforcement had loosened. The result? Messages got delayed. Governors in far-flung provinces started acting without approval, sometimes outright ignoring orders because they simply never received them in time. In an age when controlling an empire meant controlling information, the Persians began to lose that battle. Not to an army, but to time itself. When Alexander the Great finally marched east, the Persians still had massive armies and resources, but they lacked the rapid coordination they once had. It's hard to fight a coordinated war when your reinforcements arrive 2 weeks too late and your supply orders get lost halfway across the desert. The empire's great machine of governance had rusted quietly, and by the time anyone noticed, it was too late. Now let's jump to another silent empire killer. Too much paper. No, really, paper, or more precisely, bureaucracy. The late Qing dynasty in China is a prime example of a power strangled not by invasion or rebellion, but by its own mountain of documents. By the 19th century, the Qing bureaucracy was so massive, so tangled in procedures, that it could take months, sometimes years, to get an important decision approved. Officials filled their days writing reports, stamping seals, and passing requests up and down the chain, with layer after layer of red tape slowing everything to a crawl. The bureaucracy was so rigid that when urgent matters arose, like modernizing the navy or reforming the tax system, they got stuck in a maze of protocol. By the time the emperor was officially informed and action could be taken, the moment had often passed. Foreign powers with more nimble governments exploited this weakness. Britain and France didn't just win wars against China in the 1800s. They won them because the Qing response was delayed and outdated. Ironically, the very system that was supposed to make the empire efficient and stable became a suffocating blanket. By the time China realized its governing machinery was too slow for the new industrial age, it had already lost critical wars, ceded important territories, and watched rival powers carve spheres of influence right out of its body. The fall wasn't a sudden explosion. It was death by paper cuts. In the winter of 1941, Nazi Germany's military machine looked unstoppable. The Wehrmacht had rolled over Poland, crushed France in weeks, and was deep inside the Soviet Union, seemingly on the verge of victory. But the downfall of Hitler's war effort didn't begin with a dramatic battle or an assassination plot. It began with something so ordinary that generals barely noticed it. Logistics. Trucks broke down on icy roads. Supply trains were delayed by snowdrifts. Fuel barrels froze solid. And the small, unseen culprit behind this failure wasn't Soviet tanks. It was the cold. The brutal Russian winter, with temperatures plunging to 40 degrees, seeped into every seam of the German advance. Engines stalled, lubricants thickened, and men suffered frostbite by the thousands. It wasn't just that they lacked proper winter uniforms. It was that the infrastructure to fight in such conditions didn't exist. Soviet soldiers, adapted to the climate, had fur hats, layered clothing, and insulated boots. Germans wore thin wool coats, relying on quick victory to outrun the season. When that didn't happen, they were trapped, frozen not only in place, but in morale. The Red Army counterattacked outside Moscow, pushing them back for the first time in the war. And that's the quiet truth. It wasn't just Russian bravery that turned the tide. It was the way ice, frost, and frozen oil cans quietly worked to dismantle one of the most feared armies in history. The cold didn't need a general, it just needed time. Fast forward to the 20th century's other great power, the United States during the Vietnam War. Here, the quiet destroyer wasn't frost, it was public opinion. The US entered the conflict with overwhelming military superiority, confident that technology and firepower would crush the Viet Cong. But as the war dragged on, television began broadcasting unfiltered images of burned villages, wounded soldiers, and coffins draped in flags straight into American living rooms. This wasn't propaganda. It was raw reality. Mothers saw their sons return in body bags. College students saw peers drafted against their will. Marches and protests grew larger, not because the US was militarily defeated, but because the home front stopped believing in the war. The US government could handle enemy bullets, but not the erosion of legitimacy. By the early 1970s, this quiet but relentless shift in public mood made continuing the war politically impossible. A superpower was undone, not in the jungles of Vietnam, but in the minds of its own citizens. And then there's a quieter, stranger example, the collapse of the once mighty Spanish Empire in the early 19th century. For centuries, Spain had ruled territories across the Americas, extracting gold, silver, and resources to fuel its wealth. But deep beneath that power, a silent change was brewing: Creole identity. In the colonies, children of Spanish descent born in the Americas, the Criollos, began to see themselves less as Spaniards and more as Americans. They still spoke Spanish, practiced Catholicism, and traded with Spain, but their loyalty shifted slowly and almost invisibly. The Napoleonic Wars in Europe distracted Spain, leaving its colonies largely to govern themselves. And in that brief absence, a quiet realization spread. We don't need Madrid to rule us. The eventual independence movements in Venezuela, Argentina, and Mexico weren't sudden outbursts. They were the flowering of decades of quiet cultural separation. The Spanish crown didn't lose its empire because of a decisive battle. It lost it because it didn't notice how deeply its colonies had stopped thinking of themselves as part of Spain. The quiet shift in identity was irreversible, and by the time the revolts began, the empire was already dead in spirit. Sometimes the downfall isn't a shout. It's a whisper that's been echoing for years, waiting for the right moment to be heard. It's strange to think that an empire can crumble not because of a massive army, not because of an earthquake, not because of some devastating plague, but because of paperwork. The Ottoman Empire, for centuries, was one of the most powerful states on earth. It had a fearsome army, sprawling lands from North Africa to the Middle East, and the jewel of Constantinople as its capital. Yet, by the 18th and 19th centuries, the empire was drowning in something surprisingly quiet: bureaucratic decay. This wasn't a collapse that made headlines overnight. It was more like a slow leak in a mighty ship. Over time, the Ottoman administrative machine, once efficient and feared, became a tangled mess of titles, offices, and endless forms. A single request could take months to process. Decisions that once required quick, decisive action got buried under layers of officials who had little interest in fixing problems, and every interest in protecting their personal perks. It didn't help that corruption was practically baked into the system. Officials bought their positions through bribes and then squeezed as much wealth as possible from their posts before moving on. If you wanted anything, from permission to collect taxes to a military supply order, you'd better be ready to grease some palms. This red tape was invisible to most outsiders, but it was suffocating the empire from within. Armies weren't supplied in time. Tax revenues disappeared before they reached the treasury. The very machinery that was supposed to keep the empire running became the thing that slowed it to a crawl. By the time European powers were industrializing, the Ottomans were still struggling to get approval for basic infrastructure. While Britain was laying thousands of miles of railway, Ottoman officials could argue for years about where a single track should be placed, and sometimes the project never happened at all. In the end, this invisible drag didn't look dramatic, but it was lethal. Wars against Russia and uprisings in the Balkans exposed just how hollow the empire's strength had become. The slow suffocation of bureaucracy had quietly drained the life out of a giant that once terrified Europe. Sometimes it's not the battlefields that destroy an empire, it's the paperwork. Sometimes empires don't fall because their enemies are stronger. They fall because they start chasing illusions. Wealth, territory, and prestige become obsessions, even when the cost quietly eats away at their stability. This happened to Spain in the 16th century. After discovering the Americas, Spanish galleons brought home mountains of silver. At first, it felt like infinite wealth. They could fund armies, build palaces, and dominate trade. But the sudden flood of silver sparked something far more dangerous: inflation. Prices soared. Ordinary Spaniards struggled to afford basic goods, and the government kept borrowing more to keep up appearances. Over time, the empire's foundations were hollowed out. The quiet killer wasn't war, but an economy drowning in its own treasure. Other times, the enemy is an idea that slips past walls and armies, like faith, ideology, or even doubt. In the late Roman Empire, Christianity began as a persecuted minority faith. Over centuries, it quietly transformed the empire's culture, values, and institutions. By the time Christianity became the state religion, Rome's political machinery had shifted so much that old imperial traditions couldn't hold the same sway. This wasn't necessarily a violent takeover, it was a cultural one. The Rome that fell in the West was not the same Rome that had conquered the Mediterranean. Its mind had changed long before its borders did. And then there's the danger of overconfidence, the belief that nothing could possibly bring you down.
The Qing dynasty in China
Was one of the richest and most sophisticated powers on earth in the 18th century. But their rulers believed their empire was so advanced that foreign technology and ideas had little to offer. So when industrial powers arrived with steamships, advanced weapons, and modern diplomacy, the Qing were unprepared. It wasn't one battle that doomed them. It was decades of underestimating the speed of change. While the dynasty tried to keep the world at arm's length, the world was already rewriting the rules. History shows us that it's rarely the loudest threats that decide the fate of empires. A single idea, a shift in trade, or even the invisible hand of economics can be far more dangerous than armies at the gate. The greatest powers often fall not with a bang, but with a quiet turning of the tide, a tide they don't notice until it's already sweeping them away. Some great powers collapse with a roar, others slip away so quietly you barely notice until the crown is gone. The armies are scattered, and the once mighty capital is a shadow of itself. The story of the Ming dynasty's fall is one of those moments where a slow drip eventually broke the dam. In the early 1600s, China was the largest, most advanced economy in the world. Its armies were vast, its bureaucracy refined, its palaces glittering. But beneath the marble floors and silk robes, there was a quiet enemy no soldier could fight: silver. Or rather, the lack of it. You see, the Ming's economy ran on silver. Farmers paid their taxes in silver, merchants traded in silver, and officials drew salaries in silver. But when global trade routes shifted and the Spanish Empire's silver shipments from the Americas started drying up, the entire system began to suffocate. Suddenly peasants couldn't pay their taxes. Merchants hoarded what little silver they had. Prices skyrocketed. A loaf of bread might cost 3 times more than it did the week before. And the more silver vanished, the more desperate people became. This wasn't a dramatic siege or a legendary battlefield loss. This was quiet starvation and empty market stalls. The government tried to fix it by raising taxes, but that only broke the weakest farmers first. Rebellions began to flicker in remote provinces, small at first, barely noticed in Beijing, but each year the embers grew hotter. By the time the rebels were burning towns and marching on the capital, the empire's military couldn't even pay its soldiers. Many deserted without firing a shot. In 1644, when rebel leader Li Zicheng's forces entered Beijing, the Ming emperor hanged himself in the Forbidden City. The fall of one of the most magnificent dynasties in history had been set in motion not by an invading army, but by the quiet disappearance of the silver coins that kept its heart beating. And while silver could sink an empire in the East, a shortage of something far more ordinary, paper, nearly shattered one of Europe's most feared powers. During World War I, Germany's military might was the stuff of legend. But fighting a war on multiple fronts meant devouring resources at an impossible rate. Ammunition factories needed paper for cartridge wrappers. Bureaucracies needed paper for orders, maps, and records. Even propaganda, the lifeblood of keeping morale high, needed tons of paper to churn out posters and leaflets. But Allied blockades had choked off supplies of wood pulp, and German forests couldn't keep up with the demand. The result? Soldiers at the front began receiving orders written on scraps of wallpaper. Civilians found that newspapers were now 1 page long, printed so thin you could almost see through them. And propaganda? It shrank from grand, inspiring posters to tiny handouts that got lost in the mud. It's easy to underestimate how much a war machine depends on something as simple as paper. But without it, communication slowed, coordination faltered, and the once terrifying German war machine began to lose its edge. It wasn't the single cause of their defeat, but it was a quiet crack in the armor. History loves its big explosions, but sometimes the real story is in the whispers, in the silver that stopped flowing, in the paper that ran out, in the tiny things that, one by one, loosened the bolts holding the greatest powers together. until the whole structure fell. Sometimes a civilization doesn't crumble with swords or gunpowder. Sometimes it unravels in silence, through something so subtle that its people barely realize the damage until it's too late. Our next quiet killer? Paperwork. Yes, actual paperwork. In ancient China, during the late Ming dynasty, the imperial government became obsessed with documentation. Every decision, every report, every minor issue had to pass through layer after layer of bureaucrats. On paper, it sounded like a way to keep control. In practice, it became a death sentence for efficiency. If a local governor needed emergency grain to feed a starving village, the request had to go up the chain, written in the right style, sealed with the correct stamps, approved by officials who might not even be in the same province. By the time help arrived, if it arrived at all, the famine had already done its work. The empire was drowning in its own records. One historian even called it death by red ink, because while the Ming spent months shuffling documents, pirates raided the coast, rebellions flared in the countryside, and foreign powers crept closer to their borders. The Ottomans fell into the same trap centuries later. Their once lean military command turned into a tangled mess of reports, decrees, and permissions. Generals sometimes sat idle because the correct forms hadn't been signed. Here's the thing. When leaders are buried in bureaucracy, they lose sight of reality. The world outside keeps moving, fast, and enemies don't wait for your stamp of approval. And so some of history's strongest empires weren't defeated by a stronger army, but by their own desks, their own pens, their own piles of unanswered scrolls. Sometimes the end of an empire doesn't come from war, politics, or even economics, but from an invisible army no one can see. And one of the deadliest silent destroyers in history? Rats. Not the cartoon kind with cute whiskers, real, disease-carrying rats that swarm cities, ships and granaries like living shadows. These creatures didn't need swords or siege engines. All they needed was food to chew and dark corners to breed. And once they hitched a ride in trade caravans and merchant ships, they became the perfect couriers for one of the most terrifying killers in history, the Black Death. The Mongol Empire at its peak stretched from Eastern Europe to the Pacific. They had crushed armies, conquered kingdoms, and reshaped the world. But all their skill in warfare couldn't save them from what came next. When the plague began spreading along the Silk Road in the 14th century, carried by fleas living on the backs of rats, it moved faster than any army. By the time Mongol traders and messengers reached distant cities, they weren't just bringing silk and spices, they were bringing death. It's said that during the siege of Kaffa in 1346, Mongol forces catapulted the corpses of plague victims over the city walls, unknowingly unleashing the disease on the defenders. Whether this was the first act of biological warfare or just a desperate move, the result was the same. Rats and fleas spread the plague into Europe, where it would kill tens of millions and cripple entire kingdoms. The Mongol Empire didn't collapse overnight because of the plague, but it shattered the delicate connections that kept such a vast territory united. Trade slowed, cities emptied, and rebellions found new ground as the empire's once unshakable authority began to crumble. No grand battle decided it. No hero saved the day. Just tiny rodents carrying death in their fur, undoing centuries of human ambition, without ever knowing they'd changed the course of history. And rats weren't finished. They kept doing it for centuries, helping sink Napoleon's dreams in Egypt, weakening armies during sieges, and spreading disease faster than any general could react. Sometimes, the smallest creatures are the ones that can chew through the foundations of the mightiest empires. Some empires crumble not with the clash of armies, but with the silent spread of ink. Few people realize how dangerous ideas can be until it's too late. The Ottoman Empire, at its height, stretched across 3 continents. It was a multi-ethnic powerhouse, with janissaries guarding its cities and a bureaucracy as tight as the weave of its finest carpets. Yet for centuries, it feared one small object more than enemy cannons: the printing press. When Gutenberg's invention began transforming Europe in the 15th century, books became weapons, cheap, fast, and able to cross borders in disguise. In Europe, the press spread literacy, fueled revolutions, and dismantled the unquestioned authority of kings and churches alike. But the Ottomans, wary of its power, banned printing in Arabic script for Muslims for nearly 300 years. The reasoning was partly religious, partly political. Scribes held sacred jobs copying religious texts by hand, and officials feared that printed material could spread blasphemy, heresy, or sedition faster than the state could contain it. But the real danger was control. A literate population with access to unfiltered ideas could start questioning not just the imam or the sultan, but the entire imperial system. While Europe raced ahead, publishing pamphlets, maps, and scientific breakthroughs at lightning speed, the Ottoman world lagged behind in information warfare. By the time the ban was lifted in the 18th century, the gap was impossible to close. Europe had centuries of accumulated knowledge and the means to spread it instantly. The Ottomans had beautifully handwritten manuscripts, but their slow trickle of information couldn't compete with the flood. It wasn't a siege or a battle that weakened them here. It was a quiet delay in embracing a technology. And in the modern world, where ideas move faster than armies, that hesitation became a fatal wound. Sometimes the most dangerous weapon in history is a thought, especially one printed 1,000 times over. And so we return to where we began, not with the sound of trumpets, not with the clash of swords, but with the quiet creak of history turning on its hinges. We've seen how entire civilizations have been brought to their knees not by the enemies they feared, but by the quiet forces they barely noticed. The Persian Empire unraveled in whispers of betrayal. Rome's streets rotted with apathy. The Ming dynasty collapsed under the soft weight of complacency. And the great colonial powers, so confident in their dominance, found themselves disarmed not by cannons, but by patience, persistence, and the slow erosion of control. These quiet forces often move like shadows. A simple trade route shifts and a kingdom starves. A single invention spreads, and centuries-old power structures collapse overnight. A cultural shift begins at the dinner table, in the market, in the songs people hum under their breath, and within a generation, the rulers find themselves strangers in their own lands. History's grand stage is often stolen by these background actors, unseen until they take their final bow, leaving the audience stunned at what just happened. It's tempting to think that the fate of nations is decided by great men and women, by speeches and battles and sudden explosions of violence. But the truth is more unsettling. Many of history's most decisive moments didn't roar, they whispered. They came not as earthquakes, but as the slow drip of water wearing away a stone. And when the final moment came, when the fortress doors swung open, or the empire's heart stopped beating, those in power often looked around in disbelief. wondering how it had all happened without them noticing. The quiet things have always been the most dangerous. Disease traveling along a caravan road, a shift in weather patterns, a book printed in a hidden shop, a rumor whispered in a crowded tavern. These are the seeds of revolutions. The cracks in the walls, the untraceable causes of collapse. By the time the noise arrives, the riots, the battles, the declarations, the true work has already been done. The fall was decided long before anyone heard it coming. And here's the strange part. The quiet forces are still working today. As you watch this somewhere in the world, a superpower is already being undone, not by war, but by something so small that most of its leaders haven't even noticed. Maybe it's a subtle shift in global trade. Maybe it's the quiet spread of a new idea, invisible but unstoppable. Maybe it's something as ordinary as a generation growing up with a different view of the world than their parents. The question isn't whether the greatest powers will fall. They will. The question is, will anyone hear them before they hit the ground? Because history's greatest collapses rarely start with a bang. They start with the sound you never hear at all.